Okay, everybody ready? We can begin? Okay.
Please.
So
Thank
the background is the Gemara here on Daf Beis Amud Beis. Again, we are jumping around a little bit. After this, we're going to go to another topic on Gimel Amud Aleph and Amud Beis, Amud Beitzas, but we want to finish this topic first. So just the background is that the Gemara on Beis Amud Beis, first establishes that the Mishnah is talking about two different cases. It says Shnai Moksim Betalis, right? Zeh Marni Mitzasiya, Zeh Marni Mitzasiya, Zeh Markula Shali, Zeh Markula Shali. So the Gemara was troubled, as we know, by the double language. Why am Ani Mitzasiya, Kula Shali? Why the need, to elaborate so much? So the Gemara says that the reason for that is because there are two different cases in the Mishnah, and it wasn't so obvious that we would treat these two cases identically. One case is mitzia, zeomrni mitzasiya, zeomrni means, and what that means, I found an object, meaning an object which appears not to have an owner, right? And as such, two people came across an object. The question is who claimed it, who picked it up first. So zeomrni mitzasiya. Each one claims that he picked it up before the other one. And that's the Shnai Moksim of Mitzia. What's the case of Mekach or Memkar? So the Gemara says that there was an owner, and then the question is, who did he sell the property to? Ruvain, let's say Levi owned a watch, let's say, or whatever, and he wants to sell it. And the question is, did he sell it to Ruvain or did he sell it to each one? Ruvain and Shimon. Ruvain says, I bought it. Shimon says, I bought it. So that is the case of the Mishnah. So on that, the Gemara has the following comment. The Gemara says, Mekach Memkar, if indeed Mekach Memkar is one of the cases of the Mishnah, this is 3, 6, 9, 10 lines from the top of the page on Beis Amud Beis. It's 10 lines down. So the Gemara says, Mekach Memkar, v'lechsi zuzi miman nokat. Why would there be controversy trying to figure out the claims and counterclaims of each of these people, each one making the claim that he's the owner? Why don't we just, as we said last week, follow the money, see who paid the money, who can prove, or
We're on the source sheet.
I'm sorry?
We're on the source sheet. Or
this Gemara? No, we'll use the source sheets in a minute. But the first Gemara in Bab Metzia is not on the source sheet; it's in the text of the Gemara itself. So, but we'll get to the source sheets in just a minute. But Lexi Zuzi Mimanaka. Why don't we just see who paid for the object, or who he took money from? So the Gemara says, "Otzricha denakat mitravayu michad midaita michad bal korche, v'lo yadana miu midaita umiu bal korche." Now the case is a case where two people want this object, and both of them put money on the table. And the question is, only one of them, money was accepted willingly to purchase the object. The other one just, tried to force
money without a kinyan wouldn't
against the ratzon, against the will of the mocher. And but now that it's all over, it's hard for the mocher. Either he doesn't remember or we don't trust him anymore.
Since there's no kinyan,
I can't hear you.
Since there's no kinyan, it doesn't help anyway.
Well, there's a mishapara. It's called a mishapara, meaning if I pay for something, even if the kinyan is incomplete, so then retracting after that point. That's a Gemara in the fourth parak.
At this point, who's holding on to the object? Both
right.
of them?
So that's exactly the issue. So we'll get to that in just a second. That's exactly the question. So the Gemara says that since two people put down money, that's why there's a problem, and we don't trust the mocher. So the question that you're asking is the key question. So the reason it's the key question is because the Gemara in Kiddushin and the Tosefta and Bab Metzia, I'm just reviewing a little bit what we said last week to get us back to where we can move forward. It says, Bamed Dvar Mamurim, when do we believe a mocher? Just like when do we believe a dayan, or when do we believe a chaya? Bamed Dvar Mamurim, the equivalent in all cases, when they're in control, when it's not too late.
When they're focused.
So So in the case of Mekach, b'medvar mamur b'shasha mikcho biyado. When he's still holding, the mocher still has the object. He hasn't, passed it on to the other fellow yet. Aval b'shein mikcho biyado, eno nemon ela kid adam bi'alma. That's what the Tosefta says. He doesn't have any more credibility, than a man from the street. Now, there's this special expertise or power or need to rely on him, whatever it is. That, according to the simple reading of the
During the
Tosefta and the Gemara,
momentary focus.
applies only as long as he is in control of the object. So the problem is,
it's an issue of focus.
according to Rashi, it's an issue of focus. This is what we discussed last week. According to Tosfos, it's a kind of a migu. According to the Ran, it's a din drabanan, but it's a question of having to rely on this person because there's no one else who knows. So there are different explanations that are given, but the simple reading of the Gemara is that this special nemonis only applies beyond. Now the problem, and we went through this last week. I'm just getting us back to where we need to be. The problem is that if in our Gemara we're applying that here, our case is shnayim oxen batalas, so it's not bisman shemikha biyado. So how can the Gemara say that, if there was only one person who paid, we'd believe the mocher? Why would we believe him if it's shnayim oxen batalas and it's no longer biyado? We just said that it only applies bisman biyado. So this is what we discussed last week. The Rif and the Rambam take the position that even though the Mishnah says shnayim oxen batalas, the physical shnayim oxen batalas is only in the case of the Mitzia. It's a legal shnayim oxen batalas if it's in the hands of the mocher, but there are two candidates for who the proper recipient is. And that's a chiddush. I discussed it last week, so I'm not going to discuss why it's a problem. I also tried to explain last week that for the Rambam, who follows the view of the Rif and says we're talking about, this object is in the hands of the mocher, it works out perfectly based on other discussions that we've had about the Rambam's view of Shnayim Oxen B'Talas. The Balitosis take a different tack. For them, it's all about migu. Migu only applies when you're in a position of power. The real issue in the Gemara, as well in Kedushin, is about migu, but here in Bab Metzia, it's about something else. And I'll get that in a second. For Rashi, it's what you said before, focus or concentration or responsibility. The way Rashi says is it's not lav dafka b'zman shemikol biyado. Just to believe him about the most complicated circumstances, that's limited to bisman shemikol biyado. Why? Because as Rashi puts it, it's rami alei ledayek or ledaktek, meaning imagine the midwife. She's the one who delivers the baby. Let's say there are two babies, they're twins. One is a bechor and the other is not. If she is a responsible person, she's going to be super attentive, and careful, because it all depends on her, So the same is true about a dayan. Dayan is going to be super careful to make sure that he awards, the victory to the right party. And the same is true with a mocher. He sells his product, he's getting money in exchange or whatever it is, so it's his responsibility to make sure that he passes the object, he transfers it to the right party. But the second, that his part is over, you could say the adrenaline stops flowing. Now he's processing it neurologically, in a different place. It's not in his hippocampus anymore. It's now
He's on to the next case.
His memory cells, whatever you want to say.
No, or he's on to the next case.
Yeah.
In other words, he's
100%. So, but the point is, Rashi says it's not an absolute, because he still was somebody who paid close attention, who people were relying on, and who felt that responsibility. So if it isn't too complicated, says Rashi, then he's still better than a regular person, and we would believe him. And that's what we mean when we say it's shnayim oxen b'talas. However, if it's only one person who paid the money, and the question is to remember which one it was, that's more decisive. Then we don't apply the rule of bamed dvar mamur b'zman shemikol biyado. That prerequisite or that condition is dropped. If it's more complicated, more easily confused, So then we do apply the rule. Then we say, you know what? As long as he's under pressure and he needs to concentrate, so he's being super, attentive, and cautious, we believe him. But if it's a complicated issue, then once it's done, it's done. He puts it out of his mind. As you say, he moves on to the next case, or he's just relieved and he doesn't need to, focus so much on it. So that's Rashi. What did Tosa say? So Tosa says, in our Gemara here, we have a problem because the way Tosa read the Gemara in Kedushin is that it's based on Migu. But if it's based on Migu, then there's no flexibility, unlike Rashi. There's no flexibility to say, oh, he remembers somewhat even after he gave up the object, because it's Migu. Migu is a power factor. So you can't say that. So Balitosis came up with a new idea, which then became a cause celeb, meaning a huge controversy in the entire halachic world, and it divided, great authorities. And that is, he came up with the idea that, the nemanus of the mocher in this case is not to tell us, who keeps the object in the sense of you shouldn't say achloku, you should award it to one person and not the other. No. He's kol adam because he's not holding on to the object anymore. What is it with regard to? It's with regard to the oath, the shvua. The Mishnah says that shnai mosa metalis yachloku b'shvua, meaning Reuven and Shimon each claim to be the owner. They're both holding on to the object. Each one takes half, but each one only takes half if he takes a shvua, an oath, saying that he doesn't own, that he owns at least half. So what Tosa says is, this is a chiddush. Tosa says, really what's going on here is we know the mocher doesn't have the power anymore because he's not holding the object to determine who gets the object. So they're going to split it no matter what. But what he does have impact on is the question of the shvua. Why? Because he's no worse than an eid echad, than a single witness. Now, a single witness in general imposes a shvua daraisa, a biblical oath on the party who he, accuses or contradicts. So if an eid echad, a single aid, comes to court and he testifies that Reuven owes money to Shimon, right, and Reuven denies it, nonetheless, he's not strong enough to be motzi mamon, to force Reuven to pay money to Shimon, because there's only one witness, not two witnesses. But it is enough to force Reuven, if he wants to be exempt, he's claiming he doesn't know anything, he has to take a shvua daraisa, a biblical oath. So that part isn't such a chiddush. But Rabbeinu Tam says, in our case of the Mishnah, if the mocher says Reuven is right, or Shimon, it doesn't make a difference. Say pick Reuven. So he says Reuven is the true purchaser. We don't believe him completely because it's not biyado anymore. But why wouldn't we believe him as an eid echad? Now, if we believe him as an eid echad, says Tosas, two things happen. The first one is pretty standard, and that is if the eid echad supports Reuven against Shimon, then Shimon should have to take a biblical oath, not just a rabbinic oath. And there are differences. I don't want to get into them right now. But a shvua daraisa is more chamor than a shvua darabanan. And if there's an eid echad who creates a chiyuv daraisa, then the kenegdo, the other party, should have to take a shvua daraisa.
Which would then result in a stalemate?
I can't hear you. Just say again?
Which would then result in a stalemate?
No, the stalemate is in the achloku, but
No, in other
again,
words, if the eid echad says Reuven's right, so
Yeah.
Shimon has to take a shvua. Shimon takes a shvua. What happens now? Before we get
you say
to the
achloku.
chiddush, before we get to the chiddush, what would happen then?
You still say achloku on the.
So we're back to square one. In other words, everything goes back to the way
No,
it was.
not square one. It's not back. Without this new development, we would have said yachloku, and each one takes a shvua drabana. What we're going to say now is with the eid echad, which is the new ingredient,
Shimon
we're still going to
Shua
say
D'Oraisa.
Achloku,
Shimon takes the Shua D'Oraisa.
but Shimon's going to take a Shua D'Oraisa, and the biggest Kiddush of Rabbeinu Tam is that Ruvain doesn't have to take any Shua. Ruvain, who was supposed to take a Shua D'Rabbanan, is exempt. Now that the first halacha, namely that if there's an Eid Echad, that the other party has to take a Shua D'Oraisa, to be exempt from paying, that is on the books. That's the regular din of Eid Echad. Eid Echad
Shimon takes the Shua. At that point, stop the cameras. At that point, when Shimon takes the Shua, what happens to the object?
Same machloku.
So then what's changed here?
If he doesn't take the Shvua,
So he takes the Shua D'Oraisa. Okay, Shimon, he has to. He has no choice, right?
normally he would have had to take a Shvua. Normally both of them would take a Shvua D'Rabbanan and Yachloku. Now one of them takes a Shvua D'Oraisa, and the other one doesn't have to take any Shvua, but they still do Yachloku.
So basically, what happened is that Shimon had to up his Shua to a D'Oraisa, and Reuven doesn't have to even make a D'Rabbanan Shua.
Correct. That's what, so Tosa says that is, you have to understand how innovative this
But
is.
the end result doesn't change, because if they had both
Well,
taken
it depends what you
D'Rabbanan,
mean. Meaning you seem to be discounting the importance or even the deterrent effect of having to take a shvua, especially shvua.
No, I'm not. I'm just saying that, but the end result still is the Yachloku.
Yeah, it does, because it shouldn't affect that. That's true in general. Let's say Ruvain says to Shimon, "You owe me $100," and Shimon's, what we call kofar hakol, which we'll be discussing. Shimon says, "I don't owe you a penny," and then Ruvain produces an eid echad, not two eidim, a single aid, who backs up his claim that Shimon owes him $100.
So let's
Shimon
take
have
it
to pay.
for the
Does
right.
Shimon, 1 second? Does Shimon pay the $100? No, he has to take a shvua d'oraisa.
That's
And
what
then
I'm
doesn't pay anything.
So what I'm saying is there's nothing. You make it sound as if there's something atypical or unusual here. That's the rule. That's another way of saying the rule that only two witnesses can be motzi mamon. Less than two witnesses don't have power to be motzi mamon. They have power to impose. A Eid Echad has power to impose a shvua. Now again, if the fellow refuses to take a shvua d'oraisa, he has to pay. That's called. We're going to discuss that. That's called mitoch she'eno yachal shava mishalim. If he has a biblical oath and he refuses to take it or he can't take it,
I'm not discounting the severity of the biblical oath. What I'm
Yeah.
saying is that if he wasn't treated as an Eid Echad, they would both take a Shua D'Rabbanan and it's Biyachlokum. Okay? Now with the Eid Echad, it's true that only one takes the Shua, but the end result is still Yachlokum.
yeah. I'm just saying there's nothing unusual about that.
No, I'm
That's
saying
why I gave you the kofar hakol. That's always true. All that means is that Eid Echad does not have the ability to change the material result, meaning it can't be motzi mamon, right? If he can't be motzi mamon, but he can only be mechayev v'shvua. The chiddush of the Balitosis was that he can be mechayev v'shvua shekenegdo, but what we didn't know ever before is that he can be Messiah and be poter the shvua of the person whose aid, he comes to. He's advocating for Ruvain. We always knew that in the debate between Ruvain and Shimon about, money matter, that an Eid Echad cannot affect the mammon directly. We always knew that Shimon, the target of Ruvain's, indictment of testimony,
let's take a Shua.
is obligated to take a shvua d'oraisa. What we never knew before, because it doesn't
The other
usually
guy's
come
off the
up,
hook.
is that Ruvain, if he has a shvua in the same case, would be exempt from that shvua.
Does Shimon have to take the Shua D'Rabbanan?
No, because he's taking the shvua d'oraisa. the shvua d'oraisa is worse than the shvua d'rabbanan. I mean, more chamor, more severe.
So is it written in the Torah that inyanei maimon is to
Required two witnesses. The pasuk says.
Where is that written?
I think in Parshas Shoftim it says, lo yakum, well, we'll see the diuk in a moment. Lo yakum eid echad lekol avon lekol chatos. That's the pasuk. And then we'll see in a moment, the Rosh is going to quote this pasuk. The Gemara, it's really a Gemara in Masechet Shavuot, Daf Mem Amud Aleph, where the Gemara says that based on that pasuk, Lo Yakum Eid Echad L'Kol Avon or L'Kol Chatos. So the diuk, the language of the Gemara is L'Kol Avon or L'Kol Chatos Eino Kam, meaning an Eid Echad doesn't have the ability to engender a court implemented punishment like malchus or mammon or korban. It does not have that component. But the diuk is lekol avon or lekol chatas eino kam, aval kam hu lishvua. Meaning the eidach, that's the limud. It's a biblical law. Meaning this is
Rabbi, can we go back for a minute?
sure.
The שניים אוחזים בטלית, זה אומר חסד שלי, זה אומר it for me. Why can't we demand both parties to take שבועה דאורייתא?
Because Shvua Doraisa is only in 3 cases.
But if we ask them, both of them, to each one to make a שבועה דאורייתא,
Right.
then it's much easier to figure out who is right.
Well, yes and no, but you just don't have the wherewithal to impose it on them because the conditions are not, conditions that
all the
engender that kind of shvua.
Shomer.
Let me explain that. This is what the Rambam. It's clear from all the Gemara, but the Rambam begins Hilchot Toin Venitan by stating the following. You know what? I'll read it.
There's 3 cases. 3 cases of Shvua D'Oraisa.
Why should I tell you what he says? He's such a good writer. We'll hear it from his own words. So the Rambam begins Hilchot Toin Venitan just to answer your question, to give more background, by saying you should know what Shvuot are Doraita and what are Dorabanan. Okay?
Okay.
So he says, this is halacha bet. Ein lecha mechuyav shvua min haTorah. We do not, have any biblical oath obligation, right? Other than chutz mi shlosha, other than 3 cases, and we're going to think a lot about these 3 cases. What are the 3 cases? One is mi shahoda b'mikzas hamataltalin. If I say to you, you owe me $100, and you respond and you say, I don't owe you a penny, that's called kofer hakol, denying the whole thing. But if you say, I owe you 20, I just don't owe you 100, that's called modeh b'mikzas.
B'mikzas, sure.
Now, we'll see why later on. That's the next Gemara that we're going to do. But modeh b'mikzas, admitting part of the charge against you, triggers a shvua doraita. That's one. It's asher yomar ki huzeh. That's what
yeah.
Okay. So one example of a shvua doraita is modeh b'mikzas. Now the case of the Mishnah Shnai Motzim B'Talis is not a case of modeh b'mikzas, right?
No, of course not. Of course.
Right. So it's not going to qualify from that point of view. What's the second option? Number 2, umi shechivo. I'm reading the Rambam again. Mi shechivo eid echad. If you have the support. If you are opposed by an Eid Echad, so he can't be Motzi Mammon because you need 2 Eidim for that, right? L'kol avon l'kol chatos. But what he can do is he can obligate you, if you want to remain exempt, to take a Shvua D'Oraita. Now the case Shnai Mosim B'Talis, all things being normal cases, there's no Eid Echad, correct? Except in this case, we'll get to it in a second. What's the third example of Shvua D'Oraisa? Shvua Tashomrim.
Oh, yeah.
So Shvua Tashomrim is the case is as follows. It's a little bit complicated, some of the details, but in broad terms, it's not so complicated. It's as follows. I give you, let's say I make you a shomer, meaning I have you watch an object for me, or you want to use it, let's say as a shoel or a socher, or I give it to you to watch, and either you're doing me a favor, so it's called shomer chinam, or I'm going to pay you. That's called a shomer sachar. There are arba shomrim hem. There are 4 Arba Shomrim, and there are four Shomrim: Shomer Chinu, Shomer Sachar, Socher, and Hashoel.
Yeah, in Hamafkid, we know that.
Yeah, Hamafkid and Perak Hashoel and Perak, the two Sochers. Anyways, the point is, let's say now, if I give you something to watch, right, and then something happens to the object and you can't return it to me, right? So then you owe me a shvua explanation. That's called shvuas hashomrim. Meaning, and it's also, by the way, it's very unusual. We'll talk about it. It's the only of the three shvuot doraita, which is betainas shema. Because if I give you my object to watch and then something happens to it, I don't know that you did anything wrong because I wasn't there, right? So let's say you say, you know what, it was struck by lightning, you know. So do I know that it was or wasn't struck? I don't live in your house, right? So it's actually a very interesting case. We'll discuss it. But the point is, if let's say I'm a shomer sachar is liable for theft. I mean, he's getting paid, so he has to make sure that he guards it against theft. But if an accident takes place, an act, what we sometimes call an act of God, everything is an act of God. But the
Min hashamayim,
yeah, I mean, there's an earthquake, there's a flood, there's a lightning strike, whatever it is. It's onsin, it's called. What?
Ones, that's what I was saying.
Onus, yeah.
Yeah.
So Amaisa Ones. So Shomer Sachar is Pater Mionsin. So what is the Shavua of the Shomer Sachar? He has to say, listen, I can't give you back your object. If he can give back the object, there's no problem. It's called Hashava. Hashavas Hapikado. If he can't give back the object, he has to account for why he can't give it back, what happened to it. So let's say he says, it was struck by lightning. I'm a Shomer Sachar, I'm Pater. So that's when the Torah said, you know, we will believe him if he takes a shvua, but we insist on having a shvua. So those are the three shvuot doraita. Everything else, you know, I'm not talking about shvuas bitui, where you say, oh, I promise you I went to work yesterday. No, that's the difference. I'm talking about shvuas. These are called shvuas hadayanim. I mean, the shvuas that are relevant to a civil legal proceeding. In other words, where there's a dispute between the litigants, you know, and Reuven says this and Shimon says that, and we're trying to figure out, you know, who to believe, and you know, and with respect to what, you know, applications. That's called dine toin v'niton, and this is called shvuas hadayanim, meaning a shvua that takes place in a monetary court. So the only shvuot daraita are moed v'miktsas, shvuas hashomrim, and shvuas eidach. Anything other than those, now we have a whole slew of shvuot that are drabanan, all over the place. But you know, for example, the seventh parak of Shavuot, of Masachet Shavuot, begins with Elu Nishbain Vinotlin, with a whole group of shvuos drabanan, which are called Nishba Vinotel. I mean, normally the shvuot doraita, the three that we're talking about, but it makes us Shomrim, Eidachad, are called shvuos nishba v'niftar. It's always the defendant, the person who's, you know, not the claimer, but the claimant, I guess, who, you know, he's taking a defensive oath to exempt himself from paying. That's called nishba v'niftar. There are some other nishba v'niftars drabanan too, something called shvuas heses, like we say, a kofar hakol, if a person denies, you know, completely, I say, you owe me $100. He says, I don't owe you a penny. Or he says, I never met you. Or I met you, but I didn't borrow from you. Or I borrowed from you, but I paid you back. That's called kofar hakol. So in Torah, he's exempt from a shvua. Midrabanan, they instituted something called a shvuas hases. That's an example of a shvua drabanan, which is nishba v'niftar. He takes the shvua and he is exempt. But there are many shvuos doraisa that are called nishba v'notel. For example, the Gemara says in the beginning of the seventh parak of Shavuos, an example, sachir. Let's say you have a worker. Let's say you have a worker and you have a balabayas, you know, so, and there's a dispute whether or not the balabayas paid the worker. So in Torah, that's kofar hakol. Let's say the worker comes to the owner, or the balabayas is, you know, the person who hired him, and he says, you know, you didn't give me my wages. And let's say the balabayas says, what are you talking about? I just paid you yesterday, right? So that dispute is a minat Torah, that's called kofar hakol. He says I owe the worker says I owe him $100 and I'm denying it. But it doesn't matter if it's a worker and an owner,
There are some
or if
issues
it's a
surrounding
loan,
that.
or on a deraisa level, it doesn't make a difference because it's kofar hakol, right?
But there are
However,
some issues
one
surrounding
second,
that.
the Mishnah says that we want to there's an interesting combination. We want to protect the laborer because often laborers are economically challenged, and a love whom say it's not.
Also, the Balabayas might forget because he has many
Yeah,
works.
excellent, exactly. And the Balabayas, the Gemara says, is Torud. He often, is again, it's not true in all cases, but often the person who's hiring is in a much, it's a big enterprise. So he has a lot of workers. So he's Torud Bipalav. So maybe he thinks, he's telling the truth, but maybe, he's not really paying so much attention. So both the greater stakes for the sakir and the lesser maybe focus of the balabayas impelled the rabbis to make a takana. It's called bishvua sacher, that because he's torud and because he's desperate, to say, what, if they have such a dispute, instead of saying kofar hakol and he's patur, we should say let him take a shvua durabanan, meaning the sacher, nishba v'notel, and then we'll let him collect his wages because we really have a strong inkling, that he's telling the truth and that the
By the way,
Alabais isn't lying intentionally, but he's not.
not to get distracted, but there is a bit of mother mixus here because it is established that the guy was in other words, like mother mixus, the reason he has to swear is because he didn't just make it up. He already admits that there's something there.
Well, no, he admitted that he hired him, but that's not.
The fact that he doesn't deny that he was an employee is to some degree like
Well, that isn't motive and mix us exact, but what we will call that, if you want to call it something, I'll give you another example. I guess we're just getting a little far afield, but the Gemara calls that a kind of Gerora de Mamona. I'll just give you the example where it comes up. Also, Gemara and Shavuos, I mentioned before that Midrabanan, they made a rabbinic enactment that in the case of most cases of Kofar Hakol, there's something called a Shavuos Heses of Nishba v'Niftar Midrabanan. It's only a rabbinic obligation because it's Kofar Hakol, but it's a Shavuos Heses. There's a debate in the Gemara whether or not they enacted Shavuos Heses in all cases of Kofar Hakol, or only in cases of kofar hakol where there's a kind of George and Mamono, which is what you were calling a bit of moda mixas, but it isn't moda mixas. Meaning, if the guy says, if Reuven says to Shimon, you owe me $100, and Shimon says, what are you talking about? I did, but I paid you. That's called a bit of Drora de Mamono. And everybody agrees that even though it is kofar hakol, because he's saying, I don't owe you a penny, he's not admitting any of the claim, but he is admitting that there was a
relationship.
A relationship. So that's why everybody agrees in that case. Rav Nachman was instituted this Shavuos Heses. However, if the guy said lahadam, which means short form,
lo hayu dvarim
me'olam, which means not a word of it is true. Right now, that again, that could take form two different. I don't even know who you are, or I know who you are, but I never lent you money, or at least I didn't lend you money this time. So it's a bigger denial. He's even negating, the kesher, the connection between them, right? So there's not everybody agrees. There's even a question, la halacha. Again, we paskin that we accept the legislation of the Shavuos Heses, but there's a debate whether it applies only in the cases of hikzartiv, where the Dror de Mamona cases. I did, owe you, but I gave it back. Or will it apply even in the Kofar Hakol Gamor, Beli Dror de Mamona, Lahadam, Lohoy Dvarim Me'olam. So, but again, Sachir is an example, and then Mishnah has others of where we created a new category, Shvua D'Rabbanon, called Nishba V'Notel, that you swear. By the way, it's an interesting question. We'll see in a moment. What is our Mishnah? Mishnah here in Bam Metzia is Shnayim Oksum B'Talis. Each one's going to be Yachloku. Each one's going to take half, and each one has to take a shvua. Is it a Nishba V'Niftar or is it a Nishba V'Notel? Is each one swearing, to be exempt, or is each one swearing so you can take?
It's both.
Ah, what do you think that depends on?
It's both. Depends what angle you're looking at it from.
Right. So we spent quite a few shiurim in the beginning of the year, talking about what Shnai Moksem Betalis Yachloku means. And whether it's a din vadai or din safek, whether or not we look at it as if almost like there are two different objects, and each one is holding the whole, or at least each one has an exclusive tfisa on half of the object. If you look at it that way, then each one's swearing to retain what he already has. So in a way, that's a shvua drabanan, which is patterned after shvua d'oraisa. It isn't shvua d'oraisa, but because no more makes this is no shomer, there's no eidechad. But it's a nishba v'niftar because basically each one is holding on to half, and they're going to keep their half as long as they swear. However, according to the Rambam and the Rif and others, they don't see Shnai Moksem Batalis in that way. For them, it's more like what we call, a Sumchas idea, moment amuta b'safek kolkin, meaning two people are grabbing onto an object, neither one has a tfisa because they negate each other. According to the Rambam, it might even apply when they're actually not physically holding onto it at all, which is why, the mocher holding onto it isn't so bad for the Rambam. So then what is the shvua? Then the shvua is nishma v'notel, because they're not swearing to retain, the part that they already have. They're swearing in order to split the object and each one to take, right, to seize the initiative to take a half of this object. So it's not a coincidence that the Rambam actually in Hilchos Toin V'Nitan, when he describes I think I mentioned this when we learned it, but might not have appreciated fully then without this background. And that is that when the Rambam describes the shvua of the Mishnah, which is a shvua drabanan, he calls it a, shvua ke'ein doraisa b'nekitas chayfetz, which means that you have to hold a Sefer Torah. That's the Rambam's like euphemism, usually, to refer to a shvuas nishba v'notel. So some people are surprised by that, but it isn't really surprising at all because the Rambam's view of Shnai Moksem Batalas is that each one, when he say achloku, is actually taking, not retaining, not keeping, but taking a half of the whole.
Or he's,
According to
or he's
Balei
swearing,
Tosfot,
or he's swearing that he doesn't own the other half.
No, because each one really says that he owns the whole. The very, you're putting your finger on a correct issue, which is why do we have such an awkward formulation of the shvua? Why does each one take a shvua that I don't own less than half?
Because we
Why
can't.
not just say each one is really claiming is I own the whole? So the Gemara explains that the reason for that is
Can't force a
because-
lie.
yeah, we don't want we don't want the court to force each one to take a shvua that he has
Somebody
the
has to
whole,
lie.
because then there's a vadai shvua sheker that's yotze mi bezdin zeh, and that's just
So-
not.
So
You could
when
say it's
Shimon
on them.
takes a shavua de deraisa, is he then
It is shvua drabanan, but even a
is
shvua
he then
drabanan, we don't want to
equivalent
force.
to two edim?
Say that again.
If when Shimon takes a shvua the deraisa of
Yeah.
from the Torah,
Yeah.
is he then equivalent in the eyes
No.
of the court of two edim?
No, it's short of two edim.
Because it's clear that you need two edim.
Right.
So they're making him equivalency when he takes the shavua of two edim.
No, well, the reason that he takes a shvua and that we don't just hand over the money is because his stature and therefore his credibility and his authority is significantly less than the gold standard, which is two edim, right? Let's take the parallel case. If there was two edim, two witnesses, let's say Reuven says to Shimon, "You owe me $100," and Shimon says, "I do not owe you a single penny." Right? That's called kofra kol. Right? Now, if there is an eid echad, a single aid, who says he owes him the whole thing, he owes him $100. So then Shimon has to take a shvua d'oraisa that he owes that he doesn't owe him $100 to contradict the eid echad. But if there were two eidim, he wouldn't have to take a shvua; he would just win the case. if I go to court and I say, Reuven, Shimon, you owe me $100, and Shimon says, I don't owe you a penny, and then right away, or a day later, or a year later, or 20 years later, I bring witnesses who reinforce my story, then forget about the shvuah. I win the case. We take the money from his bank account, and I get paid. So Eid Echad is not, a shvuah is not mamon. It doesn't give me access to mamon. Eid Echad is not shnayim eidim. The question is, what is it then if it isn't? And that's, I think, what the questions that you're all asking are good questions, and they kind of highlight, what the actual legal quandary here is. Namely, we're talking about what, if there was another one of these, Eid Echads, then we would have to aid him, and we'd have the gold standard, and whoever had them on his side would win the case, and the other side would lose, and we would take money, from their bank account. And if they did something worse than monetary, if they were Mechalo Shabbos b'mezid, or they killed somebody, or they were over Avodah Zarah, or whatever, or they did other things that make them chayma, we would throw the book at them, whatever the book is, in a particular case. If you have two witnesses are totally, unless there's some problem with the witnesses, they're contradicted, there's something shady about them, but all things being equal, two witnesses come to court, we believe them about anything and everything. If two witnesses come to court and they testify against 100, 1,000, 1,000,000 people, right, that they did X, and the 1,000,000 people are denying it up and down, but there are two witnesses who say, again, unless there's something fishy, legally, right, we fully subscribe to the story, as if we're, witnessing it ourselves. We treat it as factual, what the witnesses are telling us. And that's true for monetary consequences, for malchus, for death penalty situations, etc. But in Eid Echad, again, if he had come with a friend, a friend who's kosher le'edus, in this case, then what I just described would happen. But he doesn't. He's a single aid. However, if he's a single kosher aid, it seems like he's also more than what we call Eid Echad Ne'eman B'Isurim, a topic that we've discussed, in past years. Meaning we have the principle that a single witness, even if he's not a kosher aid, let's say he's a karov, let's say he's a relative, right? So is believed when it comes to things like kashrus, right? If an Eid Echad says, even he's my brother, he's my father, he's my son, he's whatever it is, he says, I can tell you that this is, chaleb, you can't eat it. Or he says, this is shuman, you can eat it, right? That's called Eid Echad Ne'eman B'Isurim. Now, it's clear that Eid Echad, who's Mechayev Shvuah D'Oraisa, is only an Echad kosher. He can't be a karov. He can't be a Nogea B'Davar. He can't be a puzzle, right? So if he's a thief, for example, so he's puzzle liedus, but he's not necessarily puzzle, well, that's a question. For Namanus, that's a question, or at least to rehabilitate someone, to make him a kosher aid for Mamonis and for Shvuah, takes more than to rehabilitate him, certainly, for Namanus. So the point is, in the hierarchy, like if you have like a graph, and you're trying to, visually, depict, the different levels of credibility, and impact in terms of evidence and information. So on the top of the list, on the top of the graph, is two witnesses. As long as they're not challenged and there's no reason to suspect them of anything, they produce facts. Then on the bottom of the list, we have, levels of nemonos, and we have Eid Echad Ne'eman B'Isurim. By the way, we talked a little bit about the unique, stature and status of people who are like, experts or professionals, or, uniquely in a position to know. For example, a dayan, a chaya, a midwife, in other words, a judge, a mocher, a father and a mother with regard to their children. Differences between the father and the mother too, but that's also on the hierarchical list. Like if you were trying to figure out what does the halakha think about,
And on the opposite side is the mother-in-law.
I hear that.
She's not believing
Yeah,
at all.
the
A quick
everywhere. So this is the question: where does Ein Echad Kasher, who, if he had a mate, meaning a partner, would be Shnai Maiden, the gold standard, but he isn't, but he's certainly able to accomplish more than a Karov, an apostle, who have Nemanus Lagabe Isurim. So how much is he like, a Edus minus, or how much is he, we'll call it, Idachon Neman Bisurim plus? That's an interesting question, right? And it's a very natural question to ask. Even, if you visualize it on the graph, it's clear. Even if you don't visualize it, you just conceptualize it or you think about it. There's there are levels of authority or authenticity or credibility, that and we know this in our world also, right? There are certain people or certain objective, in a court of law, in a secular court of law, or even in terms of your own,
we have expert witnesses.
Belief system. Everybody has, a kind of hierarchy in their mind, of things, that assigns a value in terms of how compelling, the credibility of certain things are, whether it's people or situations, So this is exactly what's happening here as well. We have this very interesting concept of Ein Echad, b'mamon, not having mamon authority, but having shavua authority. And we're trying to figure out what exactly it is. So what we know about it, that is undisputed based on you asked me before, what's the source? L'kol avon l'kol chatas hu de'eno kam aval kamhu l'shvua. At minimum, we know that means that if the Ein Echad opposes, if the Ein Echad basically, establishes an argument or facts that are contrary to one of the Balei Dinim, that Baal Din has to defend himself. He has to take a shvuas nishba, the niftar, the nitva, has to address this shvuah. That we know to be the case. We also know that if he refuses, by the way, so that triggers another concept that the Gemara speaks about in a few places, in Bava Basra and in Masachet Shavuos, and that is the principle and then again, this is part of the story of mitoch she'eno yachal yishava mishali, which means if he refuses, or in some cases, in many cases, if he can't for some reason take the shvua d'oraisa, he's not knowledgeable, or there's some other impediment. If he cannot swear, then he will pay. So I said before that Ein Echad is not, credible. He has no authority in the area of mammon. But that isn't completely true, because a shvua can end up converting into mammon if he either doesn't want to or can't. The details are not important for now, although they are very important. Take a shvua. So there's a mammon. If shvua can turn into mammon, that would seem to point to what we'll call the edus, aspect of Ein Echad b'shavua. On the other hand, part of what we identify in edus is the fact that it is the highest standard and that you can't go any higher, and that we treat it as a fact. We have the rule that says trei kameya. Once you have two witnesses, right, it's just as if you have a million witnesses. Yeah. And if you have a contradiction between groups of witnesses, let's say you have two witnesses saying one thing and you have 100 witnesses contradicting them. What's the law? It's a toss-up. Because trei kameya, you can't do higher than two. Now that concept namely that you've reached the top. If that's really part and parcel of what Edus really is, you don't have that in Eid Echad because Eid Echad isn't the top, right? And if there are two Eidim against one Eid, you'll always go with the two Eidim. So it's complicated.
It's actually
It's
foolish to
particularly
bring
complicated when we examine.
more than two Adam.
What's that?
Actually foolish to bring more than two Adam.
I mean, you're opening yourself up to some problem. I was once at a wedding.
If
We
one of
had
them
a
is
pasta
found to be,
a lot of pasta. So
Yeah, I was. Well, no, you're right because of the principle. I was at a wedding once that I was once I was at a Masada Kedushin at a wedding, and the chassan asked me if he could have more than two witnesses because he wanted to be mechabed. He wanted to honor more than one
looking for
Bad
trouble.
idea.
friend or a rav or whatever it is. Now, legally, you could do that. But I told him absolutely not because of what you just said, which is you're asking for trouble. It's a very interesting thing. Again, we're getting a little far afield, but it's an interesting point, so I'll comment on it very quickly. Meaning you're opening yourself up to possible problems. And even if you don't think there are problems in this particular case, it's just a bad idea because people will, notice. The whole point is you want to be mechabed, you want to honor someone,
Think
and then other
something
people
wrong
will
with
do
one
it,
of
and they
them.
won't have the kind of controls because we have this rule of Eidah Shabbat Mitzvah Batla Kula. If you have, 20, 100, a million Eidim in one kat, and one of them is, delinquent, he's puzzle in some way,
and the whole group is
the whole thing gets torpedoed. Now, why that is maybe because a kat is an indivisible unit. So beyond two, it's in a way, it's what we said. You can't do better than two. So when you have two plus, you have a million, it's still two plus.
I think that's why Rav Soloveitchik used to say to the exclusion of everybody else, no?
Yeah. So when I'm a Sada Kedushin, I do that. But it isn't his invention. That's really, it comes from a Ritva b'Shem HaRa'ah. The Ritva quotes his Rabbi, the Ra'ah, that, that at a wedding, you should be what he calls miyached the edim. And I do this whenever I'm a Sada Kedushin. Most people, I think, do, which is you identify exclusively who the edim are. Soloveitchik used to say, make sure to point the edim to the exclusion of all others.
Yeah.
But that's really what the Ra'ah says, which is that in order to avoid the potential problem of Eidah Shabbat Mitzvah Batla Kula.
You say these two to the exclusion of everyone else there, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly what you do. So it's an interesting thing because on the one hand, we say Trei Kameya, which means that two witnesses are as good as 100. And that's why maybe you say Batla Mitzvah Batla Kula, because in this, you draw a circle around the kat, you say, oops, within the kat, there's a psul. Doesn't matter if it's, one of the two. I mean, in theory, it doesn't matter, but instinctively you would think that it would. Or it's number 999,000 to the millionth. It doesn't make a difference. In the kat, there's a puzzle. That's a problem. But at the same time, there's a famous discussion or debate between Reb Sajagon and the Ramban. The pasuk says in Shoftim, Al pi shnayim o shlosha edim yakum davar. So, and that's, by the way, that's the source of the Gemara in Masechet Makos that says hikish shlosha l'shnayim, ma shnayim nimsa echad mehem karav u'pasol Eidah Shabbat Mitzvah Batla Kula, af shlosha, nimsa echad mehem karav u'pasol Eidah Shabbat Mitzvah. This is a Gemara it's really a Mishnah and Avav Amud Aleph in Masechet Makos.
Yeah.
Meaning because Trey is Kameya, and therefore Shlosha is Kishtayim. So just like if there was a problem, if there were two, because it wouldn't be enough. So too, if you have 3 or 20 or 100 or a million, if there's one problem, it's a problem. But at the same time, there's an interesting Ramban. The Ramban in Parshat Shoftim says, why Shnayim, Shlosha L'Shnayim, aside from the Hekesh? So he quotes from Sajagon. Sajagon had an interesting perush who said, the shnayim and the al pi shnayim or shlosha doesn't mean either 2 witnesses or 3 witnesses, said Reb Sajagon, or doesn't only mean that. It means al pi shnayim o shlosha, meaning 2 and 3 2 witnesses and 3 dayanim. So that's how the Rab Saadia interpret the pasuk. But the Ramban disagrees strongly for reasons I don't want to get into right now.
But it's not the pasuk. I mean,
What?
it's not the pasuk. The pasuk says that Bishnayim also Eidim Yakum Davar. So
Yeah, you know, it says Al Pi Shnayim or Shlosha Eidim Yakum. Yeah. So he's saying Shnayim or Shlosha Eidim here doesn't mean Eidim, it means Dayanim. But you're right. So that's one of the reasons the Ramban doesn't like it. So the Ramban says, no, so why does it say Shnayim or Shlosha? In addition to the Hekesh of Rabbi Akiva and the Mishnah and Makos. So the Ramban says, because it's always better to have 3 than 2. You feel better. If you sleep better at night, you know, when you have
I
more
thought
rather
2
than
is
none.
like 100. 1 second. I thought 2 is like 100.
So
So what does it matter if you have 50 or?
yeah. So the
cares?
answer is, that's exactly the point I'm trying to bring out. The Ramban knows this, and not only knows this, but he's one of the architects of this whole concept. The Ramban, in one of the places, says, you know, that you can never do better than 2, that we know. Ramban says for that reason, there's a very famous, I'll just tell you since we're this, we're a little bit off the track, but I'll just give you another minute to finish it. There's a famous question that the Balei Tosfos raise in Masachet Ksuvos and Bava Basra, and it goes as follows. When you have trey, when you have 2 against 2, right, so that's like a deadlock. Okay, what you say then, we'll actually get back to it for a different reason later, whether you say it's Ke'isa or Kalesa, like they knock each other out and you start from the beginning, or it's like a dead lock that, you know, is
both
acknowledged.
both
I'm
are,
not going to get to that in a moment.
both are also suspect liars now.
Say that again.
Both Adam are now suspect liars.
Well, yeah, I don't want to hear you're getting me even more off course. That's the Gemara in you're right, but that's a Gemara in Bava Basra, Daf Lamed Aleph. The Gemara says is Machlokas in Rav Huna and Rav Chizda. It's a trei kite Adam amakishim zu azu. If you have 2 groups that contradict each other, so Rav Huna said zu ba b'fnei atzma u'meida, zu ba b'fnei atzma u'meida, which means that even though there's some you just raised the point. There seems to be like a 50% chance of each kad is a liar. Nonetheless, there's something called cheskes kashrus, and each kad, you know, if they want to testify in another din Torah, even though here they're stymied, they can do that. But Rav Chizda disagrees. We pass like Rav Huna, but Rav Chizda says no. Bahadi sahadi shikri lama. That's a Gemara in Bava Basra, meaning something is afoot here. There's something foul in all of this. There's a 50% chance that each kat is a liar, and therefore you can't use any of these edim for another din Torah. Either way, the Gemara says in Masachet Shavuos, and in the end of the Masechta, like Mem Zayin or so, it comes up again, the same issue, says that you can't mix and match, even according to Rav Huna. In other words, let's say Reuven and Shimon, you know, are on the same team. They tell a certain story, and then they're contradicted by Levi and Yehuda. So Rav Huna's chiddush is, Rav Chizda says all 4 of them cannot be used going forward. We don't paskin that way. We paskin like Rav Huna, that they have cheskes kashrus, and you could use them in the future. But can you use Ruvain and Levi as a team? Can you use one from each kat? That would seem to be really pushing it, because somebody's got to be a liar in there, right? I mean, again, Reuven and Shimon tell one story, Levi and Yehuda tell another story in case number 1. Now we're dealing with a totally different case. Case number 2. Can Reuven and Levi, who called each other...
Can they pair? You're saying can they pair up? Because in one of the cases they have to be false.
Correct.
And they can't be mistaken. And why can't one of them just be mistaken?
So
and give them the benefit of the doubt, or is
right.
it's crystal clear that they're bad people?
So you know what? It's a great. What you're saying is actually very insightful, and you don't want to push me even further off the course. There's a
why not?
I guess why not? So there's a famous argument in the among the poskim. It's called the famous argument of the Chachmei Brisk, not the ones that we're familiar with, you know, from the 19th century,
right.
but in the 17th century, there were also Chachmei Brisk. Apparently, it's been a learned city for a long time. So the Shach in Siman Lamed Aleph in Choshen Mishpat records the following argument. Let's say instead of two Eidim that contradict each other, and the issue, and that there it's definitive that you can't take one from each kat, to serve in another din Torah, because Mimonov Shach, one of them is a liar, right? But let's say the same exact thing happened, but it wasn't two against two. Let's say it was one against one. Let's say it only would have been for a shvuah or something like that. This Reuven comes to court and tells a story, and then I don't want to make him seem like his brother, but Yitzchak comes to court, and contradicts Reuven.
Also, it's relative.
So the Gemara uses the expression "Eirechad bak chasha mihava," meaning, of course, if they contradict each other, they, when they cancel each other out, or they cancel out each other's effect, but they remain. And that I don't want to get to. Partly it's connected to this, but let's say you have that case, right? Eirechad keneged eirechad. Can the two of them, Reuven and Shimon, now serve as a kat in another case? So it sounds like exactly the same issue, right?
Yeah.
So the Chachmei Brisk, I guess even then, even 200 years earlier, the Chachmei Brisk were very subtle thinkers,
Analytical.
and not so predictable. So the Chachmei Brisk had this remarkable idea that even though when it's two against two, you can't take one from each kat and put them together, if it's one against one, you could put them together in a different din Torah. Now, from a pragmatic point,
Well, how do you have one? How do you have one in a case? Yeah,
let's say for Shvuah, Legabe the Chiv Shvuah, they're telling a
What's the
story.
rationale?
Let's say Reuven comes to court and he says, "I know for sure that Ploni owes money, to Ploni. Ploni says to Almoni, you owe me $100. Almoni says, I don't owe you a penny. That's ko for a call. Then let's say Reuven comes to court and he says, Ploni is 100% correct. So now Almoni should take a shvuah, right? Then Shimon comes to court and says, what are you talking about? I know that Almoni doesn't owe money,
Well, what's the rationale for the difference?
Right. So that's the reason I said it is because I was inspired by Jacob's. So what did you say a minute ago? Maybe that somebody's making a mistake, right?
Right. In other words, do they have to be?
So this is there are different ways to explain it. I have my own way to explain it, or so they should explain it a different way, but I'm going to tell you what the Nesiva says. The Nesiva says the following. He says, you know what? Why? It starts off actually in a way that's very relevant to what we are discussing, so it isn't so bad that we took the detour. And either way, the detour is kind of all connected. But
Detour is never bad with you, Rabbi. It's always Torah.
Thank you. I appreciate that. So it goes back to the following idea. The Nesiva says, how come you need Shnayim Eidim? Why don't we believe Eid Echad? Right? So you could say, there are various explanations you could give. The Ksos HaChoshen says it's Exeris HaKosov. We don't know why. The Nesiva has a fascinating answer. The Nesiva says because there's something called bidadami when it's an Eid Echad, meaning sometimes people fantasize, sometimes they make a mistake, as you say, right?
Yeah, it's human error. People make mistakes.
Human error, but meaning he dreamed it, but he thought it was real, or he thought he saw it, but he's taking
the best
a
example,
leap of cognition, a cognitive leap.
a good example.
It's called bidadami. Bidadami means it's in his imagination, meaning he's not lying, he's just fantasizing. So
right,
but
he believes in what he's saying.
Wait, 1 second. So what does that have to do with why? But what Sivas is saying, if it wasn't for bidadami, right, for human error, in cognition, we would say even Eid Echad is mechayiv mamon. That's a very big chiddush. Somebody says it before the Nesivas too. It's not for now, right? However, so what do we gain when there are two people? So both the two people could be fantasizing, right?
Not the same way.
So that's what the Siva says. The Siva says, I like to quote, it's a little bit, like
It has to be a conspiracy.
like Tolstoy's introduction, to one of his books. where he says, all, I don't think it's true, but it's a great quote. He says something like, all happy people are happy, in the same way, but all unhappy people are unhappy in different ways.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
So, well, Tolstoy was a
Unhappy
very,
people are
I don't know
they
if
could
it's
all they
necessarily
could
true.
all
I
be
think
unhappy in the same way also.
it's probably
Okay.
true in both
I never
directions.
heard that.
But anyway, what am I
Yeah,
trying to say?
I could flip that also.
Yeah, exactly. I agree with you. Anyway, but what the Nesivo says is, he says, people don't fantasize in the same way. If you're making that kind of an error, whether it's visual or intellectual or whatever it is, you have a moment. That's not that you filter that out. You filter out that possibility when you have two people. If two people tell the same story, there's no bidadami, meaning that they're imagining it, but they're innocent. If two people tell the same story, since they don't fantasize in the same way or make the same kind of error likely, not saying it's impossible, but it's very unlikely. So that filters out the bidadami part, and then it's just a question of MS and sheker. So, but what the Nesivos is saying is very profound. The Nesivos is saying that if it weren't for the imagination or the fantasy or the error part, even a single Jew's kaskas kashos would be enough to establish a fact. Others don't agree with that, but that's what he says.
Well, then you have to
However, you
ignore
have
the
the
Xeris
fantasy
Akosov.
problem.
So
The fantasy, one second. The fantasy problem is filtered out by having two. But so what does this have to do with this Chachmei Brit?
so the answer is you could believe them. The bottom line is Sivas is saying that they're fantasizing, they believe it to be true, doesn't make them a dishonest person.
When it's one against
and they
one,
can pair up together.
exactly. So this is where he says it. This is what
That's
kind
the
of
bottom
motivates.
line.
He says, "How do I explain the Chachmei Brit? It's so strange. What does it matter whether it's one against one or two against two? The idea of not cross combining them is the same principle, right? So he says, no, it's not. And the reason it's not is because of what you just said. But what you said about two Adim. He's trying to explain why it's true with one Adim. That's why I brought all this in. Meaning you were saying when it's two against two, why can't they combine? Maybe they just all made a mistake. The Nesivos is trying to explain when it's one against one, why did the Chachmei Bris think that you could combine them? The answer is you could, because there's always a possibility that maybe they weren't lying, but it was bidadami, they were fantasizing. But that's not true, says the Nesivos, when it's two against two, because that's the reason why we rely on two people in Eidos to begin with. It's because it likely filters out, the fantasy part, right? So again, it's none of this is foolproof. Sometimes, there are these crazy conspiracy theorists, and people say, "Oh, we all saw the same, spaceship, abducting, the humans." It's not. Sometimes people have mass.
Three people by
They
an
already have a
accident.
fantasy too. But the point is, it's a very compelling, kind of an argument. Um, and this way. So all of this really, everything I've discussed tonight, which mostly has come up from your questions, is all relevant. It's a little bit, off the track of what I wanted to discuss in our time as a basic.
A simple question, if I may. Very
Yeah.
simple.
But I want to at least tell you what the issue is before we leave, so we can really target.
Well, why don't you say the issue first, or do you want to hear the end discussion?
Yeah, no, let me take the question first. Go ahead.
Sumchus, who says Yachloku, does
Yeah.
he also say that there has to be a shvur?
No. In
So-
fact, with the Gemara on Beis Summit Beis, which we read already because we just read things out of order, the Gemara says, why, lema masnisin delo kasumchas, because of the shua.
So in other words, the Sumchus just simply says, give each half and nobody has to do anything.
Yeah, it's achloku b'li shua.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, so let's get back to where we were. So what we've been discussing tonight, because you've been asking questions and making very good, insightful comments, which is why I didn't want to just say, we'll leave it. The reason it wasn't, terrible to elaborate on some of these things is because they all touch on, like some of the basic concepts of two witnesses and one witness, and that is our theme. So getting back, but to explain why that's our theme and what we're going to do next is it goes back to this. So it's also, just as I say, quite a remarkable phenomenon, and it really is a window into like how halachic concepts develop, sometimes through interpretation and through, people making suggestions, to solve problems in some cases in the context of problem solving, but then those, problem solving solutions, have to be scrutinized, in terms of their own substance and how they fit into the system. And that, kind of ripples and, it keeps the system, very dynamic and very interesting and keep, us thinking in a creative ways, always about the concepts and revisiting them. So that's really what happened here. The Gemara says, "V'lexi zuzim imanaka." The Bali tells all the Rishonim were troubled. It doesn't fit in to the rules of Bamedvar Mamur B'Shoshen Mikchal Biyado, B'Shoshen Mikchal Biyado, or you could call Adam. So they, every solution, has significance and opens up a different aspect of the topic. The Rif and the Rambam said what they said, and we discussed it. The Rashi said what he said. Tosas and Kiddushin regarding the Gemara in Kiddushin, Bigu said what he said. But for Tosas to work in our Gemara, given their view of some of these other issues, they came up with the following, breakthrough. And that is, we're not talking about Yachloku and winning the case, if we're talking about believing the Mocher. We're really focusing on the Shvuah part. But if we're focusing on the Shvuah part, this is where the breakthrough come in. Maybe there's something called Eid Echad Messiah who is Poter Min HaShvuah. In other words, in addition to what we know for sure that everybody agrees to, that in biblical law, if an Eid Echad, tells a story, you don't have two witnesses, but you have one witness, that triggers a defensive Shvuah, a Shvuas HaNitva, a Shvuas Nishba v'Niftar. In addition to that concept, what about the idea of an Eid Echad exempting the person who he's advocating for from a Shvuah? So that's how we read the Gemara, because of the other difficulties, that the Gemara says, not that we believe the Mocher when he's no longer holding the object to win the case, but he's not worse than an Eid Echad. And therefore, if he supports one side or the other, why is each one taking a Shvuah d'Rabbanan? One side the antagonist should take a Shvuah d'Oraisa, because now there's an Eid Echad who creates a Shvuah d'Oraisa, which is more chomor, more severe. And as for the other fellow, right, he shouldn't have taken Shvuah d'Rabbanan because he is supported by an Eid Echad. Who said that an Eid Echad support exempts you from an oath? So a lot of half of the Rishonim in the world think there's no such concept, and it's not true, right? But the Balei Tosfos thinks that's what the Gemara is saying. Now, even then, and I don't want to get into this, so I'm just going to get it out of the way for the moment. Even then, the Shvuah that's being exempted in this case in our Gemara and in the Mishnah is a Shvuah d'Rabbanan. It's a rabbinic oath. That's what the Chazan was asking earlier, right? Maybe it should be a Shvuah d'Oraisa. We explained it's not a Shvuah d'Oraisa. There are only three Shvuahs d'Oraisa b'dayanim, and that's Shvuas HaShomrim, Shvuas Eid Echad, Shvuas Modim B'Miktzas. The Shvuah of our Mishnah is none of the above. Whether it's Nishma v'Notel or whether it's Nishma v'Niftar is an interesting argument connected to Shnai Moks and Batalis, and we discussed that. And there's more material on that, but it's enough, for our purposes at the moment, it's enough to say that there's an argument among the Rishonim already, whether it's a Nishma v'Niftar or a Nishba v'Notel. It's very consequential. But at the end of the day, it's still a Shvuah d'Rabbanan. So if this Chiddush, that a supportive advocate, Eid Echad, and Eid Echad Messiah is Poter Min HaShvuah, you could have said, even if you read the Gemara the Mechudash way that the Balei Tosas do, you still could have said that, it applies only to a Shvuah d'Rabbanan, maybe even only to certain types of Shvuah d'Rabbanan, like the ones in our Mishnah. And I'm not going to document it because it'll take too much time, but if you look at the various formulations, it could be documented. Some people say it's only the Shvuah of the Mishnah because what's called Mora Heter, some because of Rabbi Yochanan, some think it's also Shvuah. Our Shvuah is only a Hesses. Other thing, it's a certain weaker Nishba v'Notel. You could draw the line at many different places. However, what's really fascinating of what happened was that this Rabbeinu Tam reading of the Gemara was invoked by the Maharam Rothenburg, and from there it was promoted by the Rosh, one of his Talmidim, as applying not only to Shvuos D'Rabbanan and all Shvuos D'Rabbanan, but even to Shvuos D'Oraisa. So and that, again, I'm just going to read the first two lines, and then we will follow through, hopefully, with this in Yetz Hashem next week. So if you look at the Rush in our Mar Makomos, which is on page, the bottom of page 2, does that make sense? Do you have it on the bottom of page 2? It says Rush Masachet Bamitzia Perik Aleph Siman Gimel.
Rosh, yes.
Okay, great. So the Rush begins, Umidiver Rabbeinu Tam. Now, all Rabbeinu Tam said, we know Rabbeinu Tam wrote, in addition to being quoted by the Balei Tosfos, which is mostly how we know Rabbeinu Tam's views. He also wrote a small book, one Chidushim and one Shelos and Tshuvos, called Sefer Yashar, which also includes many of his views. Not all of them by any stretch. It's actually much more in Balei Tosfos than there is in Sefer Yashar, but the Sefer Yashar has many of Rabbeinu Tam Shita. So this also is in Sefer Yashar of Rabbeinu Tam, and the Ramban here quotes it also, quotes Rabbeinu Tam Sefer Yashar, very rare. The Rabbeinu Tam only speaks about Shvuos D'Rabbanan, rabbinic oaths that are exempted by the support of an Eid Echad. Nonetheless, whether it's Masorah or something else, the report of Maharam Rothenburg is Umidivra Rabbeinu Tam Yesh Limod, or maybe that's exactly what it means. Meaning, Rabbeinu Tam said what he said about Shvuos D'Rabbanan. Maybe he didn't even weigh in on Shvuos D'Oraisa at all. But from what he says, meaning if Eid Echad really has this defensive, supportive, call it capacity, to exempt, maybe there's no reason to distinguish. Maybe it'll apply even to Shvuos D'Oraisa. So, Midiver Rabbeinu Tam Yesh Lilmod, we can derive that Eid Echad poter min hashvua, that Eid Echad has the ability not only to impose a shvua on the person he attacks, but also to exempt a shvua from the person that he supports. The Hevi Ram Rothenburg, that's the famous mayor of Rothenburg, right? Raya Ledvarav, Midadarshina and Bishavuos. The Gemara says in Masachet Shavuos, Mem Amid Aleph. That's where the Gemara has this drasha that I mentioned before, when you asked me what's the source. L'kol ovon l'kol chatos hu de'eno kam, aval kam hu le'inyan shvua. Eid Echad is ineffective when it comes to onshim, punishments, and karbanos, and mammon, but he is effective in the area of shvua. That's all it says. Now, if I say to you, Eid Echad is effective in the area of shavuos, right? And we know that he's effective to impose a shvua on his antagonist, right? So is the rubric, let's call it, in the area of shavuos, quote unquote, does that include defending and exempting the person who he's supporting? Or does it just mean in creating a chiyuv on the other party? So the Maharam Rothenburg assumed there's a davar pashut. No, it's a broad statement, categorical statement. In the area of Shavua, we believe in Eid Echad. In the area of Shavua, in one direction or another, right? To impose on the antagonist and to exempt, on the advocate. Aval kam le'inyan Shavua de lo miata kra. That's what the words mean. The pasuk doesn't in any way exclude, one direction over the other. Bein chiyuv shvua, bein li pater mishvua. It just says kama l'shvua, right? The ode, moreover, kavachomer. This is very interesting. We'll talk about this more next week. The Rosh says, obviously, he wasn't so comfortable. By the way, in some versions of the Maharam Rothenburg, especially in the Mordechai, they then quote the continuation of that Gemara in Masachet Shavuos, which is very crucial and which really kind of crystallizes the question that we asked before. What did we ask before? In the hierarchy, right, of authority, and credibility, at the very zenith at the top is Shnayim Eidim. That's truth. That's fact. Right? And the bottom or towards the bottom, you have things like Eid Achonem and Bisurim, and then you have things along the way like a Dayan and a Chaya and a father and a mother and so on and so forth. Where's Eid Echad B'Shvua? It's certainly below Shnayim Eidim, and it's above some of those others. There's also Eid Echad Be'Egla Rufa and Bisabal and Sota, which I'll maybe talk about next week a little bit. But there's a whole range of in this hierarchy. But as we were asking before, Eid Echad really belongs to the world of Eidos, even though it's less, or Eid Echad it's like a lower level Eidos, or it's a higher level Nemanus, right? So one of the things that's so fascinating is that the Gemara in Shavuos, after it has this limud of the kol avon kol chatas hu de'eno kama v'l kamu b'shvua, then introduces the following statement, which makes it sound like Eid Echad is a subcategory of Eidos, but which also triggered discussions because controversial, because there are exceptions to this statement. What is the statement? The Tanya, says the Gemara, Kol mokom sheshnayim mechayiv also mamon Eid Echad mechayiv shvua. That whenever there's a parallel, and it's the rule says that there's a parallel. Whenever two are effective when it comes to monetary matters, then one is effective regarding Shavuot. So the Rush doesn't quote it here, but some versions of the Rambam quote this line, and the Rush himself doesn't quote it, but you'll see he's working with the idea, and that is, if this were mominous, if there were two Eidim, is there any difference in the koach, in the power, in the capacity of two Eidim? Is there any difference between obligating and exempting?
Meaning if more than two or just two? I don't understand the question.
No. Two. If two witnesses, right, support you,
Yes.
if they support you when you're making a claim, then you'll be motzi mamon from the other party.
Oh, you're talking about
So let's say they support you when you're being attacked and you're the defendant and they support you, then you're going to be exempt, right?
Right. Correct.
So when it comes to two witnesses, it doesn't matter, whether or not we're talking about the defendant or the claimant. Says the Maram Rittenberg. So if if that's the paradigm and that's the, that's kind of the rule, that we have this parallel, whatever works for money and for two witnesses works for Shavua for one witness, then just like there's no distinction in the direction of defensive and offensive when it comes to Shnayim Eidim, you should say the same thing with regard to Shavua and Eid Echad. And that's the argument that they use. But in addition to that, there's one other argument. I'm going to show you the pushback next week. The Ramban in Muchamos and the Ravid in his Hasagos on the Baal HaMa'or, they reject this whole idea that Eid Echad Misayeya, that a supportive or an advocate, Eid Echad, exempts you from a Shvu D'Oraisa. So they think it's totally wrong. Yeah. So what do they say to these arguments? So one more argument before we leave the scene tonight, and that is Ve'od Kavachomeru, Eza Koach Meruba. Meaning the Rush understood, that it's not a foolproof evidence to say, it says the Kol Ovid Kol Chatas Avol Kam L'Shvua, maybe Kam L'Shvua means in any direction, or maybe it means something very specific, being Mechayev Shvua. So he knows that's not a full pro. He said, like, that's an indicator, right? But not necessarily more. But then he's thinking, if you had to distinguish between, let's say I told you that something is going to be effective in only one direction, either to trigger, meaning to generate it, to be mechayev a shvua, or to exempt from a shvua. Which do you think would be more difficult? Which do you think needs more power to
trigger? To trigger, no?
So that's what the Rush says, and he says if an Eid Echad can trigger a shvua, it certainly can exempt a shvua. What's his argument based on? He says like this: Od kavachomer, eza koch meruba, koch hamuksak, or she'ein muksak. If somebody who's in a stronger position, whose position is more protected is a better way to say it. Maybe that's the answer, but the answer is the defendant. right? Because he's the muksak. You want to take money from his bank account. You want to be
Also,
mostly
Right,
mekabel,
right.
right?
You have to prove it. You want to take it
You
out
have
of
to
my
prove it.
pocket. You have to
So
prove
the
it.
niche,
function of
this is their
active and
argument. I'll talk
passive
about the
also.
counter argument next time. I'm sorry, what did you say?
The function of active and passive also. In other words, to do something, to cause something to
I mean, that
happen.
might be in the other direction.
That's true.
Oh, I see. Yeah, well, it might be in the other direction. We'll see. But I hear what you're saying. You're saying, here you just want
To
to,
force an action
here you're
versus
defending, there you're
relieve
attacking.
somebody from doing something is not
From
the
a
same.
defense offense, point of view, and from the perspective of, oh, you are supporting the muksak, as opposed to trying to override the muksak. If you look at it from those perspectives, then the Rosh's argument is a good argument. Namely, it's more difficult, right, to justify an attack than a defense. So if an Eidachot can attack, right, the nitva, he certainly should be able to defend the nitva. That's what these words mean. Od kavachomer is a koach meruba, koach muksak, a koach shein muksak. Heva omer, koach hamuksak, the person who has, the status quo on his side, or the motzim b'chaver lavaraya on his side, whatever you want to say. Maybe that's part of the problem. He's in a stronger position. Im kain kavachomeru, right? So therefore, you should apply kavachomer. Ma kisha'ed misayeya lemi she'ena muksak, when the Eid Echad, right, is zokek es hamuksak lishava, if the Eid Echad is in support of the non-muksak, nonetheless, he's powerful enough, right, to impose a shvua even on the seemingly more protected or more formidable. Those might be different. Nitva, right? So, kishaid misayea lemuksak, if you're adding weapons to the muksak, because the Eid Echad is in support of him, kolshkein shifter renem and ashvua, then certainly that should exempt, meaning if he can impose a shvua, he should be able to exempt the shvua. Okay. And then there's more rayas, but I'll get to them later. Now, as I say, the Ramban dismisses the whole thing. Ramban says, all we know from our Masorah and from cases in the Talmud is that Eid Echad is Mechayev Shvua. And that's what the words mean, Aval Kamhu L'Shvua. But whoever, claimed, or where do we find clear evidence that he has the ability to exempt the Shvua? The Rashbats in Shita Mekubetzes, Rashbats was an important figure, the Chuvas of the Tashbates, that's the author of the Rash. He also wrote commentary on Minyan Mitzvahs called Zohar Harakia. He was an interesting figure, like a, kind of a 15th century figure, a little more of a transitionary figure. So the Rashbats, quoted in Shita Mekubetzes, says, I don't like this Kavachomer. I don't think it's true. He says, because being a muksak just means that the burden of proof is on the other side. It doesn't mean that his case is stronger. Moreover, the muksak strength lies.
Whoa, 1 second. The burden of proof is on the other side. That makes
that's just because of
stronger.
status quo, he says, not because.
Yeah, but everything is status quo. I'm saying the whole deal of muksak is status quo.
Well, the truth is, again,
what do you mean? What do you mean? I have the thing in my hand that gives me power. If it was in the other hand, he'd have the power. It's all because of status quo. Everything is status quo in life.
No. You're not understanding. What I mean by status quo here, I mean in a more neutral way. So let me explain. There are two. This is something we talked about in the beginning of the year as well. There are two circumstances of muksakos. One is like, when there's a compelling reason to think that the person, you see somebody has an object. So it's the way the Gemara calls it is chazaka kol ma shetachas yad adam hareyu shelo, meaning, if somebody's walking around with an object, then we should presume, it's not proof, but our first presumption should be that he's walking around with this watch because it's his watch. Right? That's not just the status quo. That's more. That's like a chazaka, a rove. Most people watch with a watch on their wrist. It's their watch.
It's their watch, right?
Yeah. However, let's say you have Shnai Moksa Batalis and you're trying to say each one has a chazaka. Is there any proof that each one has a half just because they're both holding on to it at the same time?
Well, to the point of excluding others, yes.
No,
Meaning
I'm not talking about
they're
excluding others.
stronger than a third party.
Maybe that we talked about, but that right, but that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about
If a
vis-a-vis
third
each
guy
other.
comes in, it's really my talus.
Yeah, I
He has
understand. But
less.
I understand. But vis-a-vis each other, I'm talking about. So the answer is no. It's more that you can't take it away from each person because that's what I mean by status quo. That's status quo where there's no compelling, reconstruction, that supports saying it belongs to the muksak. It's more that this is the way it is. In fact, in reality, we have no opinion based on this particular presentation of the facts, that it's more or less. But the fact is that to change the present status quo, the burden of proof is always to change the status quo. To do inertia, is going to apply, unless you can justify action. Right? That has nothing to do with a chazaka or a rove. It has to do with tfison muksakus being al you know, al hasheni, the person who wants to change the status. That's what I mean by status quo. I don't meaning there's a certain status quo that implies, let's say, ownership, and there's other status quo where it's unlikely, that there's going to be any indication of ownership, but it still doesn't mean that we're going to take initiative to contrary to the status quo without evidence. So what the Rashbat says is, in these kind of cases, especially, there's softened status quo, but without any compelling, reconstruction. So in that case, would you say the muksak, benefits more than the other fellow from the Erechad? Moreover, there's an interesting philosophical, theological, question too, and that is like what's the default in the world, basically? The default in the world is that people are exempt or that they are obliged. We have this in the world of. I'll just give you one example from something again that in years past we might have spoken about, those who were here.
So
That I mentioned before, Eidechon Naman Bisur, right? An aid is believed in matters of Isur. Is there a difference between him saying that it is mutter or him saying that it's asur?
Koch Terativ, doesn't that go into that?
Well, no. Koch Terov doesn't mean that. It's often misquoted for that.
No, I'm saying it's easy to
Right.
be machmir.
Koch Terah really means a Gemara in Beitza and other places.
Yes.
What it really means is if somebody who is knowledgeable, right?
Right, it's knowledgeable, right?
If a real authority figure tells you that it's mutter,
That's
he has credibility and experience and integrity, then probably the case for its being mutter is pretty strong.
Right.
Because if he was truly 50-50, his
He'd go l'chumrah.
he'd go l'chumrah. So for
Yes.
him to go l'kula, koch teira, if he's
I like how you started with the basis for someone that's really knowledgeable, because a lot of people give heterim that don't know anything.
yeah,
So I'm just saying your basis was the key.
oh, yeah, okay.
Very easy for non-Maritz to give a heter.
It's sad that that's true, but it is sometimes.
It's very true.
Anyway, so what I'm saying, so the Rashbat says, listen, the reason the Nitva's in a stronger position is because, again, it's the status quo. Nothing has happened, but it's not necessarily easier to defend once a person has the obligation to defend than it is to create. If I want to create a shua, I'm basically saying, you know what? Give me some birur, right? Maybe it doesn't take so much to demand extra clarification. We're not demanding money, we're demanding a clarification. There's a problem here. Give me some birur. But if you already owe me birur and you're trying to get out of it, maybe to get out of that, you need a stronger, koach. That's what the Rashbat says. I'll go back to my mashal. There's a debate in the Rishonim. We say Echad Nema Bisur. So there are three views. We say Echad is if he tells you it's chelev or if he tells you it's kosher, So there are three views. One is it doesn't matter which direction we believe him. It matters of Yisurin, all things being equal. And then there are others who say, you know what, the rules for belief differ if he's trying to be matir or if he's trying to be oser. But you can see logically why, is it easier to be oser or is it easier to be matir? That's a debate. Meaning, some people say like everything is oser, Lashem Aretz Beloa. If you have a doubt, then it's usher until it's mutter. And others people say no, everything is mutter, until it's usher. So
Really?
interesting.
People say everything's mutter till it's asa. What do you mean?
No,
Kashrus is not
I'm
that way.
talking about in a context of suffix, really. Meaning it goes to the question, the Rambam paskins that suffix doraisa l'chumra is a din rabbanan, and that
Right,
minatot.
but I'm saying in general, when you protect yourself, if you don't have something's kosher, you don't eat it. I'm saying
Yeah, no,
if you don't
in
know, you're
policy,
stealing, you don't take it.
right? I'm
It's
just saying
always
the
better
Rambam.
to stay away if you're not
Right.
sure.
I'm saying the
You never get in
Rambam.
trouble for not saying something you shouldn't say.
Right. I mean, that's on a policy level. That's true. But on a purely objective level, there's a debate in the Rishonim when we say suffix doraisa l'chumra, suffix drabanan l'kul. If the issue is a rabbinic thing, we're more makel in a doubt. And if it's a biblical thing, then we are machmir. I'm not talking about if you have the ability to check it out, and to ask somebody and to find out definitively
Levar.
facts. Yeah, be mavar. It's called efshel levar. But there's a debate in the Rishonim whether or not the rule of suffix doraisa l'chumra is a din drabanan or din doraisa. Most of the Rishonim, the Ramban and the Rajba and so on and so forth, they all think suffix doraisa l'chumra is a biblical rule. That you should be machmir in a biblical doubt is a biblical rule. The Rambam famously, with some exceptions, holds that sfeika doraisa l'chumra is a rabbinic rule. That actually Minatorah, with some exceptions, if you had an insolvable doubt about a biblical obligation, you would actually be Mako. Anyways, so I'm just giving you the example that, to like our muskal rishon, our reflex action is that when somebody tells us, that, somebody's like weighing the relative needs to be, to defend and to attack, you'd think, oh, it's easier to defend, than it is, to attack. And that's kind of what the Rosh is saying. The Rosh is saying, if an Eid Echad can attack, he can certainly defend, right? If he can, impose a shvuah on the muhsak, he can certainly exempt the muhsak. But what the Rashbat is saying is, number one, muhzakos, the nitva isn't necessarily a compelling, it's not like an umdana, it's not like a rove or something like that. It's more, maybe in many cases, just technically a practical status quo. And number two, it's not so simple to think that, defending is always easier than attacking. Maybe attacking, is, is enough to have a suffix. And maybe to defend when you're already under attack, maybe for that you need something stronger. So this is the debate. This is a fascinating, in addition to the question of, the nature of Eid Echad and whether its role in Shavua is more comparable to Mammon or not, there are also, like, along the way, several very interesting arguments, that are kind of halachic philosophical arguments about the direction of things. Okay, we went quite over time, but it's
Baruch Hashem, it was excellent. Thank you so much.
so, but
Well,
these are things to think about, and we'll pursue the actual concrete argument just to get a far field next week. I want to go through because then I want to move on to other topics. The argument between the Rosh and the Ramban, in particular, I want to go through a few points on that because it highlights these issues, and then we will move to like the next topic after that. Okay, so have a great week, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Cool.
Okay.
Good night.